We heard here two exciting and insightful presentations of the challenges of writing practitioner scholarship. One presentation more practical side of how to engage with the previous literature and theory. The other one, the motivations and higher level strategies of why these things are important and why there are specific challenges in this type of scholarship. I think overall the management scholarship is coming like 360 circle in a way, because the original writings and the management scholarship when the business school started, Harvard Business School in 1911, it was largely vocational writing. And it was about 40 years in 1950s after the Carnegie report that there was a big turn in most of the management scholarship and business schools towards, or management schools towards research and science. So in a way the writing genre has moved from writing towards practitioners to writing towards research community. And the genre is followed. So the expected genre currently is a research article, which what Adrian Wolfberg here pointed out, serves well if you're writing theory towards a research community, but doesn't serve very well if you're writing towards practitioners and want to have an impact on practice. Management scholarship has tried to address this issue, for example, by expecting that there are some practical implication sections in many of the articles published in management journals, academic management journals. But there are a lot of empirical studies which show that most of these are not empirically grounded and valid, and secondly, nobody reads them. So they don't really have very much impact at all. What we are trying to do here is something which comes back to it. So it tries to do a dialect synthesis from the origins of the management education and the scientific integration and the strive towards science, which has dominated the field for the last 40 years. We recognize that it's not easy and it's challenging, as pointed out by some of by these presentations, and we are in a way in an unknown land. We are experimenting and we are trying something new and different, and it's always difficult and hard, but it's also exciting because it is difficult and hard. So I'd like to hear from you, both of you, that what you think are the sort of biggest challenges in writing these new genres of articles, and how do you think that we can establish over time better criteria to understand and practices to understand how to write effectively these types of genres. So who wants to sort of start on this?
I can take a stab at that, Kalle. As you said, this is kind of new territory that's kind of undefined. This has challenges for a number of the actors involved with the whole publication process. The authors, the graduates of the doctoral programs whose research is being written about, but also the faculty in these very programs themselves, who quite often come from the scholarly tradition and expectations of scholarly journals. It will take time to kind of this educational process to kind of overcome this newness and to better understand what we're trying to do, what EMR is trying to do. Which is part of the reason why we're having this video discussion, is to help disseminate why we're doing these things, experiences in which authors have had in doing these things, and some tutorial help in framing and doing some of the writing that Lars talked about in helping stage the research. I guess the main way ahead, or what can be helpful, is the EMR, the editorial staff, and a growing body of graduates in the program and faculty are becoming more aware of the value of this unique outlet for this unique community. And over time, this will spread, and there will become a greater kind of alignment between the conduct of the research that's done by this unique community and the way that it can be disseminated in these genres of the EMR outlet.
Right. Lars?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that by focusing on, I think, one particular challenge, but also opportunity that engaged scholars face. And that is the challenge to maneuver between the practical problem context and the area of concern in the literature. So you see there are two differences here. One is the problem, which is practical, it's in situ, it is in the real world. And then against that you have an area of concern, something that people think about in the literature. And that duality can never be removed in engaged scholarship. It will always be there at the heart of what we are trying to do. And if we look at this first from a challenge point of view, the challenge is to maneuver between the two in the sense that in most cases your problem context is given. That is where you're situated, and that's what you have chosen to start out from. But the area of concern is not given. I mean, there could be 100 different you could choose. Let me just illustrate with the example of the Grabowski and my paper, which is basically situated into a small organization that over several years struggled with its real estate portfolio. And how to manage that while their mission was to help grown-up, severely developmentally disabled people. How do you juggle that? And they didn't juggle it very well. Now, is our paper then about real estate portfolio management? Could it even be about developmentally disabled people and maneuvering that mission together with other strategic challenges? Or what is it? So you see, the practical problem context might be given and specific, but there can be many different ways of positioning that in relation to the literature. And that can be challenging, but I will turn it around and say that's also a huge opportunity for an engaged scholar, because that means that you have a freedom of choice, but you need to be smart, and you need to position your research in a way so that the area of concern, as I said, afford you ample opportunity to make a contribution to that stream of literature. Actually, in our case with developing this particular paper, we were helped tremendously by the editorial team and the reviewers at EMR because what we originally conceived as the area of concern was not what ended up to be the area of concern of the paper, and what we therefore originally conceived to be our contribution to knowledge was not our contribution to knowledge. So we had good advice by these outsiders that were sort of sympathetic to the very idea of engaged scholarship, but helped us see more clearly where we could position our problem context into the literature in a way that gave us ample opportunity to make a contribution. So let me end by saying that this in a slightly different way. In traditional research, you start out from a research question. And in traditional PhD programs, you drill and drill and drill and teach your students to ask research questions. But in engaged scholarship and practitioner research, there are always two things running. And one is the practical problem, and the other is the research question. And they are not the same. They're actually different. And you need to be able to maneuver that duality both up front and in the end when you draw your conclusions.
Right, thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, just building on what Lars just said. So one could see EMR serving as two kind of practical purposes. One is to reinforce these two different ways that Lars talked about of research method and practice into the dissemination outlet itself, expressing these two voices in the EMR article itself. So that's a form of practice in reinforcing who we are, reinforcing our identity. And also in the long-term perspective, these EMR articles, specifically the empirical, but also the translation papers, become a repository for the kind of knowledge that we create. So I think there's two kind of interesting ways that the EMR article supports the short and the long-term life of our unique community.
All right, thank you. I'd like to actually follow up with one thing which Lars raised up here, but in a little bit different angle. In the classical way of writing academic articles, there's a thing which you always hammer to your students and also your colleagues, that context of discovery is different from context of justification. You write differently to convey the research results from how you came to those results, because it's not a history of how did you come up with this. It's about arguing strongly, theoretically and empirically, whatever claims you are making. In practitioner scholarship, this relationship probably is different. And it may have also impact on the way in which we have to think about how you start thinking about writing these types of articles as a part of the research process, and how you engage and balance the context of discovery and the context of justification as you move along, and how it's reflected at the outset. That's exactly the balance between the research question and the problem of practice. So do you have any ideas or any tips with regard to how do you actually accommodate those types of needs through the research process, and as you move along while you write these types of genres of articles? Tough question. Yes.
You can start again, or you can start.
As a practitioner scholar, what I found is helpful is to, there's kind of a tacking back and forth, but generally starting with the problem of practice. You do the research, you're inspired by the problem, you figure out what methods, in collaboration with scholars or others, you conduct the research. As you're conducting the research, you're tapping back into the literature as you're getting a sense of what's going on. When you've finished the research and you come up with your the so what and how meaningful it can be, then I found that's when some of the heavy lifting begins, and you've got to figure out. And Lars talked about this. You got to figure out how your research is situated, both for the purpose of conveying the story that Kalle talked about, and also for continuity of the logic in terms of contribution to knowledge. And sometimes the literature itself, as you're dipping into it, has this really strange way of shaping or contributing to what it is that you've actually found. That it may not be obvious to yourself what you found. And so it's able to stick and situate into a body of knowledge. And this is really important. It's not just an academic or scholarly thing that we're talking about. In order for something that any of us have done research and come up with some new knowledge, in order for someone else who's not done it to comprehend it or to appreciate it or to be able to critique it or build upon it and use it, it has to connect, it has to be able to be absorbed by what others know. So, what Anne talked about, absorptive capacity, is quite relevant in itself in the dissemination of the research. And that, I think, is a critical aspect of why the literature, another reason why it's important.
Lars, any thoughts on this?
So, these established genre, we see that practitioner scholars, of course, contribute to them, and they should do that, and we encourage that. But the point is that these genres are straitjackets in the sense that they force a practitioner scholar into a particular way of articulation that is not at the core of this person's identity. So in that sense, they will not open themselves to practitioner scholars and allow them to experiment with and develop their unique approach to research. And this is therefore what is at the core of the EMR genre, that is to open for that. And that would lead in as an answer to your question, Kalle, that we will see how it goes. Yeah. But I think at least it's safe to say that these two genres, the empirical paper and the translation paper, they invite the authors to embrace this duality and to not only take for given that this is my final result, but also to engage in a more iterative and maybe reflective relationship to how you did the research and to make the two come together in that sense.
I'm happy to sort of probably close here unless you have anything else to add on this topic of genres and opportunities here as a closing remark.
I have a final one that I just would like to mention, which is along the same lines, but very, very important. In traditional genre research, you have this, here your contributions and theoretical conclusions, then you have implications of whatever. And they can be implications for practice, and they can be implications for theory, obviously. And that is all good in these genres. But what you see here, both in the translation paper and the empirical paper, is a much more balanced approach to address both theoretical contributions and practical contributions and how they entangle. And this notion that you focus on one and then the rest is up to implications and speculative judgment, is rejected here. And instead, we are trying to articulate ourselves about both. Which I think is a very powerful place to be and actually quite liberating.
Yes.
On the empirical paper, I think it's helpful for graduates of these doctoral programs to consider co-authoring as a second author one of their advisors, even if they've graduated. So I think that's we've seen that as a best practice so far. So you as the scholar, practitioner, scholar, primary author, get the help of someone who's experienced writing just in general, as your second author. So that's one thing. The other is, while we emphasize the importance of research and therefore the importance of empirical genre for a number of reasons to help professionalize our identity, reinforce the way we do things, want to really emphasize the importance of the translation genre. There are many of you who are graduates of the program who have gone back into practice and likely have had a chance to explore how your research has manifested itself in practice. We'd love to hear those stories, regardless of whether they're successful or not, in how that experience transpired. So I just want to put an emphasis in for so the equal representation of the translation paper.
I'll just note one final observation based on my experience in looking at the review reports and making many times decisions about them. One thing which seems to be apparent, or is very apparent actually from the writing, is that people become very well trained in writing academic scholarship, or much better trained in academic scholarship. And the writing style and the genres and the papers which are submitted, they always reflect the ideal of an academic empirical genre or some sort of conceptual development of conceptual ideas. Whereas the sort of idea of the problem is somehow sidelined it becomes buried in all these academic posturing and building up the thing. And as a sort of a reviewer and the sort of editor of the journal, one of the biggest challenges nearly always is to try to get sort of pull them back into the world of practice and say, what does it really mean? And it looks that this is also one of the hardest part of actually writing these types of articles, which goes beyond the sort of typical lip service, which I would call more like a lip service, that you can always throw out 1 to 2 practical implications because you don't have empirical tests or any, which some of my colleagues have called pragmatic validity for those claims. We don't currently have good ways of sort of articulating what is the pragmatic validity, but the key point is that it has to be more than just throwing out something at the else. It has to follow from the story. And it has to be tightly connected with the type of model or argument which you are building, and you're making claims only about those types of practical implications which you can draw upon or infer from based on the case and the theory which you have brought into bear. So trying to be more modest but more powerful at the same time with regard to those claims is one of the biggest challenges which I find in writing these types of journals. And that's also the way in which we can become much more powerful in shaping this field as we move forward.
Can I add something?
Yes,
Just adding something to that, Kalle, thank you for talking about this aspect, critically important.
Yes.
In the specific lessons that are done in just the way that Kalle talked about that needs to be aligned, that there has to be some thought in the generation of these lessons for practice such that in the situation they actually might be perceived as achievable. There's a sense that there's a realistic a realism to these ideas, and even adding to that you might identify some ways in which these ideas might be able to move forward, or that you recognize some of the barriers, and you might even talk about the likelihood or anyway the challenges of how these may come about. That kind of stuff gives more credence to what Kalle was talking about, and we'd love to see that kind of insight into the lesson for practice section.
I think that we have had a good discussion about the sort of challenges in writing practitioner scholarship and the types of genres we expect to build up and move forward for this exciting new field of management scholarship. So thank you for all for the attention.